The pattern was impossible to ignore once you knew what to look for. Every sign that Samuel Fletcher painted wrong belonged to someone who had arrived in Copper Falls within the past year, someone who spoke with a slight accent, someone who seemed nervous when strangers asked too many questions. For over a decade, Samuel's careless mistakes had been protecting runaway slaves, escaped indentured servants, and witnesses fleeing dangerous criminals. His paintbrush wasn't just changing names, it was erasing the past for people who desperately needed a new beginning. Samuel Fletcher had arrived in Copper Falls, Montana, in the winter of 1872, carrying little more than a satchel of brushes, several cans of paint, and a letter of recommendation from a pastor in Kansas who vouched for his character and skill. At 35 years old, Samuel was a quiet man with steady hands and an artist's eye for detail. Exactly what the growing frontier town needed as businesses expanded and new residents arrived daily seeking opportunities in the silver mining boom. Copper Falls was the kind of place where people came to reinvent themselves. The discovery of rich silver deposits in the surrounding mountains had transformed a sleepy ranching community into a bustling territorial center almost overnight. The population had swelled from fewer than 500 residents to over 3,000 in just 2 years, with new businesses opening weekly and families arriving on every stagecoach from the east. The demand for professional sign painting was enormous, and Samuel quickly established himself as the only craftsman in town with the skills to create the elaborate painted advertisements that businesses needed to attract customers. Samuel's workshop on Main Street became a familiar sight to the residents of Copper Falls. Through the large front windows, people could see him working at his easel, carefully measuring letters and mixing colors to create signs that were both functional and beautiful. His reputation for quality work spread quickly, and soon he was receiving commissions from businesses throughout the territory. Store owners, saloon keepers, hotel proprietors, and even private families sought out Samuel's services to create signs that would represent their establishments with dignity and style. But within his first year in Copper Falls, Samuel began to notice troubling patterns in the people who came to his shop. Many of his customers were newcomers to the territory, people who spoke with the careful English of those for whom it was a second language, individuals who seemed to carry an invisible weight of fear or desperation. They would request simple signs for their homes or businesses, but their eyes would dart nervously toward the windows, and they would ask careful questions about whether Samuel kept records of his work or shared information about his customers with local authorities. Samuel's background had prepared him to recognize the signs of people in hiding. Before coming to Montana, he had worked with abolitionist networks in Kansas and Missouri, helping to coordinate safe houses and transportation routes for escaped slaves making their way to freedom in the northern states and Canada. He had learned to read the subtle indicators that marked someone as a fugitive, the way they avoided eye contact with strangers, their tendency to pay in cash rather than credit, their preference for conducting business during less busy hours when fewer people might overhear their conversations. The revelation that changed Samuel's life came during a conversation with Martha Chun, a Chinese woman who had requested a simple sign for the small laundry business she was attempting to establish. As Samuel worked on the lettering, Martha began to share fragments of her story. How she had escaped from a forced labor contract in California, how she had fled across multiple territories to reach Montana, and how she lived in constant fear that the men who owned her contract would eventually track her down and drag her back to a life of virtual slavery. Martha's story was not unique. As Samuel began to pay closer attention to his customers' backgrounds, he discovered that many of the newcomers to Copper Falls were running from various forms of persecution, exploitation, and violence. Former slaves seeking to establish new lives in territories where their freedom would be respected. Indentured servants who had fled abusive contracts. Witnesses to crimes who had been forced to leave their communities after testifying against powerful criminals. Women escaping violent marriages. immigrants avoiding discrimination and exploitation in their previous locations. Samuel realized that these people had found their way to Copper Falls because the rapidly changing nature of the boomtown made it relatively easy for newcomers to blend in and establish new identities. But their safety depended on their ability to completely abandon their past identities and avoid detection by the various bounty hunters, contract enforcers, and criminal associates who made their living tracking down people who didn't want to be found. The decision that would define the rest of Samuel's career came when he realized that his position as the town's primary sign painter gave him unique power to help these vulnerable people create and maintain their new identities. A simple sign painted with the wrong name could transform someone from a hunted fugitive into a respected member of the community. A carefully altered business advertisement could make it impossible for bounty hunters to connect a person's current life with their dangerous past. Samuel's first intentional mistake was made while painting a sign for Hans Mueller, a German immigrant who had requested a simple placard reading H. Mueller, blacksmith. But Samuel had learned that Hans was actually Heinrich Wistman, a man fleeing prosecution for union organizing activities that had made him a target of industrial violence in Pennsylvania. Instead of H. Mueller, Samuel painted H. Meller, a small change that would make it nearly impossible for anyone searching records or asking questions to connect the blacksmith in Copper Falls with the wanted organizer from the East. The effectiveness of this simple alteration became apparent several months later when two men arrived in Copper Falls asking questions about a Heinrich Wistman and showing a photograph that clearly depicted Hans Mueller. But when the strangers inquired about businesses and residents, they were directed to H. Meller the blacksmith, a man whose appearance was similar to their target, but whose name didn't match their records. After spending several days investigating, the bounty hunters concluded that their quarry was not in Copper Falls and moved on to search other communities. Samuel's success with Hans Mueller's case convinced him that systematic name changes could provide effective protection for the growing number of vulnerable people seeking refuge in Copper Falls. He began to develop sophisticated methods for altering identities through his sign painting work, creating changes that were significant enough to confuse pursuers, but subtle enough to avoid suspicion from local residents who knew his customers by their chosen names. The technical challenge of changing names without arousing suspicion required Samuel to become an expert in the psychology of reading and recognition. He learned that bounty hunters and criminal trackers typically relied on written records, official documents, and the testimony of local residents to locate their targets. By consistently painting the wrong names on signs while ensuring that the local community knew and used the incorrect versions, Samuel could create a protective barrier of false information that would mislead anyone attempting to trace his customers' whereabouts. Samuel's methods became increasingly sophisticated as his understanding of tracking techniques grew. For customers whose original names were too distinctive to hide effectively, he would create entirely new identities, transforming Dmitry Volkov into David Vincent or Consuela Martinez into Constance Martin. For others whose names were more common, subtle alterations like changing Williams to Wilson or Johnson to Jackson would be sufficient to break the connection between their old and new lives. The sign painter developed a careful system for coordinating his identity changes with other aspects of his customers' new lives. He would work with sympathetic local officials to ensure that property records, business licenses, and other official documents reflected the names he painted on signs. He established relationships with the postmaster to ensure that mail was delivered correctly despite the name changes. Most importantly, he coordinated with community leaders to ensure that his customers' new identities were accepted and supported by their neighbors. Samuel's work was not limited to simple name changes. He also created elaborate backstories and supporting documentation to make his customers' new identities more convincing. A runaway slave named Joshua, who had established a successful carpentry business, became Jacob Swenson, complete with painted signs indicating that he had learned his trade from Swedish master craftsmen. A former indentured servant named Maria, who operated a small restaurant, became Mary O'Brien, with signs suggesting an Irish heritage that explained her cooking style and business practices. The psychological impact of Samuel's work on his customers was profound and transformative. People who had lived in constant fear of discovery found themselves able to sleep peacefully for the first time in years. Former fugitives began to establish roots in their community, forming friendships, starting businesses, and building the kind of stable, productive lives that had been impossible while they remained in hiding. Samuel watched with satisfaction as people he had helped began to thrive under their new identities, contributing to the growth and prosperity of Copper Falls while leaving their dangerous past safely buried. But Samuel's success in protecting vulnerable individuals also attracted the attention of the criminal networks that profited from tracking down fugitives. Professional bounty hunters began to notice that their investigations frequently led to Copper Falls, only to discover that their targets seemed to vanish without a trace once they reached the mining town. Contract enforcers complained that indentured servants who fled to Montana became impossible to locate despite clear evidence that they had arrived in the territory. Criminal organizations found that witnesses who testified against them would disappear completely after reaching Copper Falls, making it impossible to locate them for intimidation or revenge. The growing reputation of Copper Falls as a place where people could disappear began to attract more dangerous attention. Criminal organizations started sending more sophisticated operatives to investigate the town, professionals who were trained to detect false identities and uncover hidden networks. Samuel realized that his individual efforts to protect vulnerable people were becoming part of a larger conflict between criminal enterprises and the underground networks that helped their victims escape. The crisis that would ultimately expose Samuel's activities began in the summer of 1884, when Marcus Kane arrived in Copper Falls with a commission from a consortium of mining companies, railroad corporations, and industrial concerns to track down and eliminate the networks that were helping their property disappear. Kane was not a typical bounty hunter motivated by individual rewards, but a professional investigator with resources and connections that made him far more dangerous than the lone operator Samuel had been successfully confusing for years. Kane's investigation methods were systematic and comprehensive. Rather than simply asking questions about specific individuals, he began to analyze patterns in the town's records, looking for inconsistencies that might reveal the existence of false identities. He noticed that many recent arrivals to Copper Falls had names that appeared slightly different on various documents, suggesting either clerical errors or deliberate alterations. Most significantly, he observed that Samuel Fletcher's signs often displayed names that didn't quite match the official records kept by local government offices. The discovery of Samuel's role in creating false identities placed the sign painter in immediate danger. Kane represented interests with virtually unlimited resources and no scruples about using violence to achieve their objectives. If Samuel's activities were exposed, not only would he face criminal charges for fraud and conspiracy, but the dozens of people he had helped protect would be revealed to their pursuers, almost certainly resulting in their capture, punishment, or death. Samuel's response to Kane's investigation was to accelerate his protection efforts while developing counter-surveillance techniques designed to mislead the investigator and protect his network of vulnerable customers. He began creating even more elaborate false identities, complete with forged supporting documents and carefully constructed backstories. He also started working with local law enforcement officials who were sympathetic to his cause, providing them with information about Kane's activities and enlisting their help in protecting the people Samuel had been assisting. The confrontation between Samuel and Kane escalated throughout the autumn of 1884, as the investigator grew closer to exposing the identity-changing network, while Samuel worked desperately to protect his customers and conceal the scope of his activities. Cain began threatening local residents who refused to cooperate with his investigation, making it clear that anyone who interfered with his work would face serious consequences. Samuel realized that the conflict was no longer just about protecting individual fugitives, but about defending the entire community of Copper Falls against criminal interests that viewed human beings as property to be recovered and exploited. The resolution of the crisis came when Samuel made the decision to abandon secrecy and appeal directly to federal authorities for protection. Working with a network of sympathetic officials, including territorial marshals and federal judges who were opposed to the criminal enterprises that Cain represented, Samuel provided comprehensive evidence of the systematic exploitation and violence that had driven his customers to seek refuge in Copper Falls. Samuel's testimony revealed the existence of a vast network of criminal organizations that used legal technicalities, fraudulent contracts, and systematic violence to maintain control over workers, immigrants, and former slaves throughout the Western territories. His detailed records of the people he had helped, combined with their willingness to testify about their experiences, provided federal authorities with evidence they needed to launch prosecutions against several major criminal enterprises. The federal investigation that followed Samuel's revelations led to significant changes in territorial law enforcement and labor practices. Cain and his associates were arrested on charges of kidnapping, fraud, and conspiracy. The criminal organizations that had employed them faced prosecution under federal anti-slavery and racketeering statutes. Most importantly, the people Samuel had protected were granted official recognition of their new identities and federal protection against retaliation from their former pursuers. Samuel's story became a legend throughout the Montana Territory and beyond, inspiring similar identity protection networks in other frontier communities. His methods were studied and refined by federal officials working to protect witnesses and victims of organized crime. The sign painting shop in Copper Falls became a symbol of the power of individual courage to protect vulnerable people against overwhelming odds. The technique of using false names and altered identities to protect fugitives was not new, but Samuel's systematic approach and artistic skills had made it more effective than ever before. His ability to create convincing new identities through careful attention to detail and community coordination had saved dozens of lives and provided a model for future protection efforts. The people Samuel had helped never forgot the debt they owed to the quiet sign painter who had given them new lives. Many of them prospered under their new identities, establishing successful businesses, raising families, and contributing to the growth of their communities. Their success served as a testament to the value of Samuel's work and the importance of providing second chances to people fleeing persecution and exploitation. Samuel continued his sign-painting business in Copper Falls for many years after the crisis with Cain, but his work took on a different character. Rather than focusing primarily on creating false identities for fugitives, he began to paint signs that celebrated the diverse heritage and experiences of his community. His shop became a gathering place for immigrants and newcomers, a place where people could share their stories and find support for building new lives in the American West. The legacy of Samuel's work extended far beyond the individual lives he had saved. His example inspired others to use their professional skills and community positions to protect vulnerable people. Teachers began providing education and documentation for illiterate fugitives. Merchants offered employment and character references for people seeking to establish legitimate businesses. Religious leaders created networks for sharing information and coordinating protection efforts. Samuel's story also influenced the development of formal witness protection programs and refugee assistance networks in later decades. His methods for creating convincing false identities and integrating protected individuals into their new communities became standard practices for organizations working to help people escape persecution and exploitation. The sign painter who had made his reputation through mistakes had actually been conducting one of the most successful rescue operations in frontier history. His wrong names had created right futures for dozens of people who might otherwise have been recaptured, exploited, or killed by the criminal organizations that hunted them. Samuel Fletcher died in 1923 at the age of 86, surrounded by many of the people whose lives he had saved through his artistry and courage. His funeral was attended by families whose names he had changed, businesses he had protected, and community leaders who understood the scope of his contributions to their town's development. The inscription on his gravestone, chosen by the people he had helped, reads simply, "Samuel Fletcher. He painted new lives with old brushes, and in doing so, painted hope across the frontier." The workshop where Samuel had created so many new identities was preserved as a historical landmark, commemorating not just his individual heroism, but the principle that sometimes the greatest service to justice requires breaking unjust laws. His story became a reminder that ordinary people with specialized skills can make extraordinary differences when they choose to use their abilities to protect others rather than simply pursuing personal success. Samuel's paintbrush had been mightier than any sword in the fight against criminal exploitation of vulnerable people. His willingness to risk his reputation, his business, and his freedom to provide new identities for people fleeing persecution had created a ripple effect of positive change that extended far beyond his own lifetime. The wrong names Samuel painted were right in every way that mattered. They gave people the chance to escape their past mistakes, their victimization, and their persecution. They provided opportunities for new beginnings, fresh starts, and the pursuit of happiness that is every person's right. In changing names, Samuel had changed lives, and in changing lives, he had changed the world, one carefully painted letter at a time. If you're enjoying these incredible, true stories of hidden heroism and creative courage, hit that subscribe button, because we've got many more tales of ordinary people who used extraordinary methods to protect others waiting for you. Click on the video on your screen to hear another story about someone who discovered that sometimes the greatest art is the art of giving people new chances at life, proving that true creativity lies not in what we paint, but in what we make possible for others.